Assembly in a personal office of Assemblywoman Susan Bonilla. I was hired after my fellowship and then stayed with her until she termed out, and then I moved over to CCST. I'm going to pass the mic off. I have some current fellows and alumni here who will introduce themselves, and then we have a short presentation, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Hi everyone, I'm Landon Klein. I am a current fellow in the Assembly Judiciary Committee. Prior to that, I received my PhD in neuroscience at UC San Diego.
Hi everyone, I'm Pajel Van Gay. I'm a current fellow as well. I'm currently placed in the Assembly Committee on Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials. I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota in computational biology.
Hi, I'm Sandra Nakagawa. I was a fellow last year in the Year 9 class. I was placed in the Assembly Judiciary Committee. I now work at the Senate Office of Research, and my PhD was in sociology from Stanford.
Good afternoon. I'm Christine Casey. I was a fellow in 2015 with the Senate Committee for Transportation and Housing. I received my PhD from the University of Rochester in New York, and I currently work as Director of Partner Engagement here at CCST.
And my name is Jeffrey Song. I am the program manager of the Science Fellowship Program. I was an alum of the program in 2018, placed in the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee, and I'm excited to be on board.
Thank you, everyone. So if you have access to a screen, a computer screen, we do have a PowerPoint up through Zoom that you can see. If you're just on the phone, no problem. I'm going to cover most of what's on every slide. So what is the California Council on Science and Technology? CCST, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were actually created 30 years ago via the California State Legislature to respond to the governor, the legislature, and other executive branch entities on policy questions related to science and technology. So we do this by convening leading researchers for expert briefings, various requests for expertise, or in-depth peer-reviewed reports, such as those on biomethane, underground natural gas storage, or fracking. In addition to those science services, we also, 10 years ago, started the CCST Science Policy Fellowship Program, where we place 15 PhD level scientists. It used to be 10. This is the first year we'll have 15 PhD level scientists and engineers in the state legislature and the executive branch for a one-year fellowship. So this upcoming class will be the 11th anniversary class. They'll start on November 1st. And then this is the first year that we are expanding placements into the executive branch. So it's a really big, exciting year for us. So why become a CCST Science Fellow? You will learn about decision-making processes firsthand. You can use your analytical training to advise state decision makers. You become a trusted member of a government office, and you gain a ton of professional skills and training. And a question we get a lot is, why California policy? Obviously, there are many other opportunities and fellowships that are not in California, but California is a national leader in environment, science, and technology. We have state-level policies that govern more than 39 million Californians, with implications that are far beyond our borders. So California policies often set the standard for other states and even federally. The CCST Science Fellows provide incredible value to California policy. We have a really wonderful quote here from the former President Pro Tem of the California State Senate, Darrell Steinberg, which says, "On behalf of the California State Senate, I would like to thank the California Council on Science and Technology for your committed partnership with the state in the successful implementation of the Science and Technology Fellows Program. The Senate's standing committees and chairs have uniformly expressed deep satisfaction with the many contributions of these highly qualified fellows to the policymaking work of the state Senate." So every year, the fellows are recognized on the Senate floor and on the Assembly floor, and this was some words that the former pro tem had shared during that time. So to date, over the last 10 years, CCST has trained nearly 100 scientists and engineers. We've seen PhD degrees from over 30 institutions from around the US and beyond. And CCST Science Fellows have impacted over 1,000 bills, hearings, and other actions in the state of California. So a very common question we always get asked are, where do alumni go on to work? And we can share more detail about this in our Q&A. But in general, most alumni either stay in the state legislature or the state agencies. Some move back to academia. Some go to nonprofits, including CCST. CCST now actually has 6 alumni on staff currently, which is quite impressive. Some go back to industry. Several have moved to the federal government, and some work for scientific societies. So what happens if you get the CCST fellowship? You show up on November 1st, and we have a month-long policy boot camp. So this is an intensive training that includes lessons from UC San Diego Political Science Chair Thad Kauser. It includes senior staff visits, networking events, and communication workshops to hone soft skills and diplomacy. It also includes a lot of mentorship from CCST alumni and the other experienced staff that we have here in the office. And you as a fellow will learn how to communicate science across disciplines and manage objectives of a diverse stakeholder group. Each Science Fellow gets direct policymaking experience. So you are placed into an office either in the legislature or the executive branch, and it's a full-time commitment for that entire year in that office. So who are we looking for? We have 15 slots. We get a lot of applicants, and what we're looking for are excellent communicators, great team players, flexible and adaptable people. That's a very important one. Someone who's effective in fast-paced environments, problem solvers, and people who are open-minded and willing to learn. The timeline for the application, we're currently recruiting for year 12 of the fellowship. The application will open on December 1st, 2019. The applications are due February 28th, 2020. Then the interviews will be in May of 2020, and then the fellowship begins on November 1st. So that's the end of our presentation today. And just follow up with us if you have any questions. My email, Sarah Brady, is on here, as well as Jeffrey's, our fellowship program manager. You can see how you can follow us on social media, where we will provide updates on when the application opens and various pieces of information like that. So we're going to enter our Q&A phase now. I'm going to kick it off with a couple questions, but we'd also like to hear from you. So feel free to use the chat box on Zoom to share any questions you have, or email Jeffrey. His email is up on the screen, or it's Jeffrey, Jeffrey, .song, SONG, @ccst.us. So let's start by asking the alumni that I have here in the current fellows, what is a typical workday like? Number of hours, demands, level of insanity?
So I'll speak to it as a current fellow. This is Landon Klein again. So I'm currently working in the Assembly Judiciary Committee, which means that I'm placed in the legislature like all current and former fellows. And the legislature sort of is on a kind of cyclical schedule. So there are times of year when it's extremely busy, and there are times of year when it's not very busy at all. We're fortunately in the latter right now. So essentially there is not really such thing as a normal workday, but during the busier period of the year, what my days typically look like will be, I will come into the office at 9 a.m. I respond to a lot of emails, set up a lot of meetings, call a lot of people on the phone. It's a lot of sort of organizing complicated multiple stakeholder things. Throughout the course of the day, I have many meetings, and in between those meetings, I spend time doing a lot of research. And then towards the end of the week, I will start drafting an analysis. So one of our objectives as members of committee staff is to draft these thorough policy analyses for the committee to read. But as I mentioned, there's not really such thing as a typical day, because you sort of have your overarching goals, and then there are kind of small fires that pop up throughout the course of the day that you just jump to, and it's fairly fast paced. That being said, in the busiest season, there will be some days when you stay late, but many of you are graduate students or have been through graduate school, and it is a much more regular schedule than that. So a typical day is 9 to 5. During the busy season, I will usually be leaving around 6 or 7. Occasionally, if I'm extremely, extremely busy, I'll stay later than that. But for the most part, it's 9 to 5, and weekends are off. Again, with the exception of if it's extreme crunch time, and even then, I would only work maybe a few hours on a Saturday.
Pajal, do you want to share a little bit?
I can add a couple. This is Pajal. I'm also a current fellow. In addition to everything that Landon had mentioned, I had a slightly different experience because I spent half my time in a personal office, and so that is a lot more unpredictable in that you're taking a lot of pop-in meetings. These are meetings with lobbyists or constituents or people who just happen to be advocating that day on particular issue areas that might be assigned to you. So it's a lot of going between my committee office, which is where I'm placed, and going to the personal office to take those meetings. Everything that Landon said definitely resonates with me in terms of it being really busy certain times and really slow sometimes. The other thing I would add is that I think the busiest time for me looked a little different. I definitely worked weekends, sometimes entire weekends, just because I was staffing a lot of stuff in the personal office. And so, for example, in the legislature, there's 2 houses, right? And so there's a point where all the bills go from one house to the other, and you're basically going through every single bill to provide a vote recommendation for your boss. So that, you could imagine, that takes a lot of time. And so that's an example of a time where it's crazy crunch time, and you're definitely working a lot. But you all should be used to that.
Christine, since we have exec branch placements next year, and for the 12th class that those listening might be in, can you share a little bit about what a day is like in the executive branch?
So the executive branch will be still cyclical, as Landon said, and as Sarah mentioned, it is important to be flexible and adaptable, because there are days where you have your plan and you know what you're going to do, and then there are days where everything blows up and you're meant to solve a task or solve a problem that pops up right then. So I worked in the Department of Finance following the fellowship for a year and a half, and I worked on budgets related to Environmental Protection Agency. So it was a lot of liaising with different departments and budget offices, and they're different busy seasons, but it kind of has that same cyclical nature where some days you're staying really late and having a meeting with some important individuals in the governor's office related to bills that are going through or the budget that's being developed, and other days where you have more of a regular schedule. And that'll be definitely new and exciting for this year 12 class of fellows to be in the executive branch and have those opportunities.
Thank you. I think we have a whole slew of questions online, so I'm going to skip over my pre-prepared questions and come back to those if we have a lull. Let's do, I'll just quickly answer the question, while you're a fellow, can you still do your PhD research? Are most fellows PhD students? So you must have completed your PhD in order to be a CCST Science Fellow. You have to complete it by September 2020 in order to be a member of the 12th class. So no, you can't still do your PhD research while you're a fellow. That being said, there are fellows that are still finishing up papers, and that's just fine. Pajal's raising her hand, and that's just fine. That's something that you do in your own time, and that's not a problem at all. But in terms of actually continuing to do research, there's really not a lot of time or flexibility for that. The next question is, can you guys share what experiences best prepared you to make the most out of your year as a fellow?
I'll start, I guess. Everyone's kind of looking around. I think that we all, as scientists and engineers, have really strong analytical background, and that is definitely useful for doing committee analysis that Landon sort of described a little bit. I think that what should not be underestimated is sort of the softer skills that Sarah mentioned developing during the policy boot camp. And I think that these are things that sort of lie in between the research that we do as grad students, whether it's extra activities that involve coordinating members of a graduate student board that you're on, or community outreach and things that dealing with people that sometimes scientists don't get a chance to do when you're doing the bench work. I think these things are important skills to have and to not only have, but have a desire to develop in order to be successful with the fellowship.
And I just want to chime in. I want to second the mention of science communication and outreach. I think one thing that's really very useful is having the opportunity to present your research to a public and lay audience. One of the things that you have to do here is sort of take very complicated political issues or policy issues and distill them down to something simple enough that you can convey very quickly and can be accessible to a wide range of audiences. And nothing is more complex in many ways than the work that's being done by all of you in the scientific world. And being able to translate that, I think, is a really key skill. I also should say the boot camp that is done here at CCST at the beginning of the fellowship is really, really good at filling in a lot of the soft skill gaps that you may not have had the opportunity to develop in graduate school. So things like being able to carry on difficult meetings or really quickly distill down a subject to a really short write-up. A lot of things like that you practice quite a bit, and to the point where you feel fairly well prepared by the time you're actually kind of tossed into the pool.
Great. The next question is about the executive branch placements and what agencies or departments do we anticipate will host fellows this year and in the future. And I'll just say placement options change every single year, so even in the legislature. So if a fellow is in an office this year, that office may, for whatever reason, choose not to interview next year. Maybe their chief consultant left and they need a year off, or whatever the reason might be. But this year for the executive branch, we have quite a list that are interested. I'll just rattle a few off the top of my head. The California Department of Transportation, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, the Insurance Commissioners, the Deputy Office of Climate Change, the Secretary of State's Office, the California Energy Commission, the California Natural Resources Agency, the Department of Conservation. Those are what's coming to mind now. So I'm sure there's some I'm forgetting, but there's been a lot of interest. And the matching process will occur the same as it always has in the past, which is all fellows interview with every single office. So the year 12 class of fellows, you will not come in as a Ledge Fellow or as an Exec Branch Fellow. You will just be a CCST Science Fellow. You will all go through training together, the boot camp, and then you'll all interview in both the legislature and the executive branch. And then CCST staff, in coordination with the leadership of the legislature and the various executive branch departments and agencies, we do placements based on best fit. So that depends on your personality, that of the office, the type of work environment, what you are looking for in this fellowship, what your career aspirations are. We really work hard to get to know you during boot camp so that we can understand where you will be most successful. And the next question is, and I'll also say there's a question about how many of our past fellows have been parents, and have they been successful balancing their roles as fellows and parents. I think we just have one parent around the table, so I don't know if they're willing to speak to this, but I will just say that that also is something that we would talk to you a lot about during boot camp. What are your ideal work hours? That's really important for us to understand, regardless of whether it's a family commitment or something else. And that would go into our considering where to place you and what the work hours and the workload would be.
Yeah, I think that's important, because it's just another aspect of what sort of environment you will thrive in, depending on other things that are involved in your life, such as being a parent. And we have recently had a parent that was in a very, very busy committee, and she made it work, and she did a wonderful job, but she knew that going in, and she was able to work with CCST staff and the committee, and just knew that was the good placement for her, that she wanted to be there. And so it can definitely work out.
Thank you. So the next question is, I am curious about what is the typical application sequence for the fellowship, as in how many rounds of interviews and what is the focus of each round? Maybe one of the current fellows can speak to that, because you went through it most recently.
Yeah, sure. So let's see. You start off with your paper application, and then once you pass that round and you are selected to move on to the next, the CCST does Skype video interview. So this is more of just for them to get to know you a little bit and make sure that you can communicate and that you are who you are on paper, at least. That's my understanding of it. It's really short. And then if you move on from that stage, then you get invited to Sacramento, and they fly you out here for an interview that takes place over about 2 hours. And you actually meet with quite a few people. These are actually individuals from the board.
It's a fellowship selection committee, so it's a very specific committee, co-chaired by Amber Mace, CCST's executive director.
Got it. Yeah. So prior to the interview, you were given, a small little sample thing that you have to actually work on and bring it to the interview to talk about. And then during the interview, you obviously ask lots of questions. Topics range from, things about your research to topics in the legislature, how comfortable you are working on X, Y, Z. They're really just trying to get to know you to see how quickly you can respond to questions and whatnot. And then after that, you get to meet some of the current fellows or alumni, and it's actually pretty short. And then I think after that, that's when the decisions get made.
Yep.
And I don't know the exact timeline of everything, so it's a little fuzzy now.
The timeline varies, right? It varies on any number of factors. We try to get an answer back within a week of the in-person interview, but we never guarantee a specific date. Thanks, Pajal. The next question is, how many fellows are usually placed in specific legislators' offices versus committees versus the executive branch? So we typically try to do an even split between the Senate the Assembly, and now the Executive Branch. So in an ideal world, we'd have 5 fellows in each spot. That being said, we do reserve some flexibility because the best fit for placement is, again, what's the most important to us. So there have been years, just based on the personalities of the fellows and the personalities of the offices interviewing, that we had, let's say, 6 in the Senate and 4 in the Assembly. So it kind of shifts around a little bit, but we aim for parity across the groups. Historically, Science Fellows have always been placed in committees in the Senate, and previously they were in personal offices in the Assembly. However, a few years ago that shifted to where in the Assembly it was also committees. So for the last 3 years, placements have all been in committees, but as you heard Pajao discuss, there are certain placements that are a little bit of a hybrid, where you're placed with the committee, but then the chair of the committee also pulls you into their personal office. So every single placement is different and offers different opportunities. And that will be very much the same for the executive branch. Every placement will be very different. The next question is, I'm not completely sure that I will be 100% done with all of my doctoral program requirements by next fall. Can I still apply this year? Also, can you apply more than once? You can certainly apply without your PhD in hand. That's a key difference between what's required for the application for CCST versus AAAS. But you have to have completed your degree by September. So you can apply without it, but you have to have a plan to have completed it. That being said, we have had fellows interview, get offered the fellowship, and then decide to turn it down because they realize they wouldn't be done in time. So we certainly encourage you to go through the process if there is a possibility that you would be done and be eligible. And you can certainly apply more than once. There is no limit to the number of times you can apply, and we've certainly had fellows that have applied more than once. Okay, the website lists social science fields and professional fields as acceptable disciplines. Can you please explain how CCST Science Fellowships can accommodate these multiple fields?
This is Sandra. I was a sociology PhD, so yes, social scientists can apply and can be accepted. I believe there may have been one professional fellow in the past with a medical degree.
Yes. Yeah. And one that had a vet degree as well as a PhD as well. Yeah. And I'll just add that your area of study doesn't always correlate with where you're placed. Landon is an excellent example being placed in the Judiciary Committee, same with Sandra. So we accommodate it by knowing what you want to learn and understanding where you'll have a successful placement. It's not necessarily focused on issue area, although in some cases it does come into play. Did any current fellows or alumni consider applying for similar programs on a federal level? And if so, what made you choose to work on the state level?
I can answer. So at least at the time that I applied, which was last year, or the year before actually, sorry, I was looking at AAAS, and that was the only program that I knew of. And I actually learned of CCST through contacting an alumni that was a AAAS fellow, and he was also a CCST fellow. And so due to the timing of when I was going to graduate, it just made more sense to do CCST. I'm also, I grew up in Central California, and I always wanted to be back, so it made a lot of sense for me. But that said, I also, came here thinking that I would probably go to AAAS afterwards, but I'm not.
And I'll add too that I was in a similar position to Pajao. I was interested in the AAAS fellowship as well, but because of their constraint that you have to have completed your PhD before you can apply, I didn't have the opportunity, and so I applied for CCST, and then fortunately was offered the spot, and so I wasn't given the opportunity to apply. But having had the opportunity to work in California government, you really get a sense that your impact is quite expansive, and to some extent, not only do you get the sense that it's going to broadly impact everyone across the state of California, which is quite a few people, but you see other states down the line adopting policies that California has adopted, and the federal government even kind of reflecting some of the same language. And once you get a sense for how the legislative process works, you see that a lot of the way it works is you're almost literally copying and pasting parts from other states' legislation. And in doing so, you have the opportunity to write language that can influence policy across the country. So I don't feel in any way limited by being influencing policy only in the state of California. And in fact, I think because of it happens to be a comparatively functional legislature, I feel like I've had a great opportunity to impact policy, possibly more so than I would have at the federal level.
This is Sarah. I'll also add, we have had CCST fellows that have come from the AAAS program, so they've done the AAAS fellowship and then come to do the CCST fellowship, often similar to Pajau, wanted to make the move back to California. We've also had fellows that do the CCST program and then move to the AAAS program, and we work very closely with AAAS, so there are a lot of opportunities for whatever path you choose to take. What do you all look for in an application to be considered for the fellowship? Do you guys want to talk about any general traits or experiences that you think helped your application or success?
Sure, this is Sandra. I would just note, looking at around the colleagues in my cohort and other cohorts, people tend to be very open-minded and flexible, and also really thrive, or at least be able to survive in more social contexts than what a typical grad school day is like. Yeah, they're very curious, love interdisciplinary work and learning about new things. Yeah, and I think plays well with others would also go in there.
Thank you, Sandra. The next question, is this type of program unique to California, or have similar programs been developed in other states? I'll answer this one. CCST has actually been actively sharing everything we've learned from getting the California Fellowship off the ground with 13 other states who are interested in developing a similar program. 2, I believe, actually have a program off the ground with either 1 fellow or 2 fellows at a time, so starting on a smaller level. Happy to share additional information about that if you want to email us a follow-up question, and there's also information on our website about that. Next question, what is one of the challenges you faced from the transition from academia to this science policy fellowship?
I guess probably being the closest to that transition, along with Pajau, we're in a good position to answer this. So I think the biggest difference is that everything is much faster paced, and there's a bit of an adjustment in terms of being able to work with the information you have within the time frame that you have to do it. So in academia, as some of the earlier questions alluded to, just however long it takes to find the answer to the question is how much time you have, and you really dig as deep as you possibly can. Obviously, the intent in policy work is to be able to dig as deep as you possibly can and perform as much research as you can, but things happen quite quickly, and there are times where, you know, I've been in a position where I've had several bills to analyze in 1 week, and they're on topics that are wildly disparate and I have absolutely no experience with, and I have to quickly determine who I can talk to get that information, quickly get as much information as I can, and then really just be comfortable with putting out the product that I can based on what I've been able to gather. I think it takes a little bit of adjustment to be able to say the information I have is good enough and trust the process that down the line anything that you've overlooked will be seen by someone else. But for me, I think that was one of the biggest adjustments.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other thing I would add is also being comfortable with providing your, I guess, opinion or your thoughts or recommendations on important pieces of legislation on the spot, and just being really quick to adapt, especially when you are potentially put into a high-stakes environment, because that will happen quite a bit. We don't really get that sort of experience in grad school, and you usually have a lot of time to come up with an answer to a question, and so I think that was probably the hardest thing for me.
Yeah, it seems it's almost an entirely different landscape that you have to learn to navigate, and there are many more mines that you can step on than in grad school. In grad school, you have a lot of room to make mistakes, and there's not really any consequence. And while we promise you will not break California by being a fellow, there are still, some important consequences of conversations that you have to be much more aware of.
Thanks, guys. Next question, why is the fellowship calendar November to November? Wouldn't it be easier for people in academia to follow an academic calendar? The short answer to that question is that it's based on the legislative calendar. And especially when it was just legislative placements, the legislature normally starts their session in January, and depending on the year, it goes until August or mid-September. And then we like to provide a little bit of buffer time for the fellows after their really busy end of session for them to continue to apply for jobs if they're still job searching, and give them some flexibility where they're still part of the fellowship while they're looking for their next job. And then the next class, we start in November because we need a month to do boot camp. We need time to do all of the interviews, figure out placements, so we can get the fellows in their offices by the start of session, which is January. So that's where that calendar comes from. Next question is, what accomplishment are you most proud of that made a real impact for people?
I guess I'll start. So like Pajau, I was in charge of carrying a couple of bills for my boss through the legislative process. One of them is currently on the governor's desk waiting to be signed, which is really exciting. I think actually, and this was interesting to me, the thing that I am most proud of is probably taking a bill that I didn't think should be a law in the first place and making it less bad. And a lot of what your job is working in committee is to identify the issues with a bill and to really work with the authors of those bills to move the needle to a place where it's much better policy. So there was a bill that I worked on dealing with involuntary commitment of mentally ill and substance abusing individuals. And I was in a position where I was actually able to make some pretty substantive changes to make that process much more reasonable. So I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that too. It ends sort of sad because it's about a bill that didn't make it through, but I was really proud of this bill that I worked on, that I staffed, so it meant that I did all the legwork behind researching it and taking it through the entire process. We had a ton of opposition. It was a water-related bill. We had a ton of opposition. It was so much work. It was super technical. It was the first time a bill like this was introduced, and even though it made it to almost the end, but didn't make it out, I was really proud of it because we got it to a point where essentially all of the stakeholders in the opposition were in support of it and were willing to continue working with us for the next round. So it's definitely the long game here, really similar to research. And despite, I'm not going to be here next year, but I'm really proud of the fact that I did that foundational work that whoever comes after me will be able to pick it up and transform it into something better.
Can I have one? Yeah. This is in a different direction, but I think for a personal accomplishment was figuring out what I wanted to do with my life and realizing when I did the fellowship, I always had in the back of my mind, I'm going to go back to San Diego where I came from doing a postdoc and maybe work in biotech or work at a company in industry. And then after doing the fellowship, my personal accomplishment was I know I am not doing that. I want to work in science policy. I want to help inform state decision making and other policies. So.
Also, just to add, in a different direction as well, I feel a great sense of pride to have been a part of this fellowship. I think it's really cool to be in the environment here in the California state government and see the kind of respect that fellows get. There are a ton of alumni of the program distributed throughout the California government, and those people are quite well respected as well. So you're part of this large network of very influential people, and you garner quite a bit of respect from very influential people just by being part of the fellowship.
Do you want to add anything, Sandra?
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Landon and Pajal said earlier about working on legislation, as a committee consultant, you're writing analyses that are part of the legislative record that will come up if a bill is challenged in court, too. So a bill that I wrote an analysis on was, is being challenged in court right now. That analysis is being quoted, and it's interesting to be like, part of my work product will go down in the historical record, and it will be in the archives, and also having the relationships and mentorship to be able to feel confident in doing that too, because I was one of those people during training that was like, are we going to break California? So being reassured that no, we aren't, and that we were given the skill set to be confident to contribute to California's legislative process or policy process when you're in the executive branch.
Our next question is about visas. We do accept non-U.S. citizens to the fellowship program. Many different types of visas will be considered, so it's hard to give you an exact list of which visa you might need. Ones that have been considered are H-1B, J-1, J-2, and spouse visas. We have some additional information on our website about this, so I encourage you to go look at that. Other visas may also be considered depending on the circumstances. Next question is, does most of the work revolve around responding to proposed bills, or do you help draft legislation as well?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely help draft legislation as well. I think every fellow in our cohort drafted and staffed, what we call it staffing bills. And so that means that, you work with lawyers who are actually part of the legislature to draft legal language that goes into the statutes, and you work through that process with various stakeholders, amend it to, make more sense depending on challenges ahead. So you definitely work on both sides. I think that the experience is definitely different depending on the bill itself. So, for example, there are a lot of bills that just make sense, they're very non-controversial. Those are very nice to have. And then there are bills that are super contentious. I definitely staffed one of those. But I think that was really added to the richness of my experience to have gone through that.
I think in the executive branch, depending on if you're working in a policy shop, it can be very similar because executive branch policy shops will respond to legislation because they ultimately will be the ones that have to do what is stated in the legislation if it requires them, but they also can work with offices to put forward legislation as well for things that need to be fixed at the department and agency level.
The other thing too is that when you're doing committee work in the legislature, you are analyzing bills that already exist, but there's also quite a bit of work that's done throughout that process to improve the language of the bill itself. And so there's quite a bit of drafting involved in the process of just sort of negotiating amendments that need to be made in order for the bill to satisfy what the chair of your committee and the rest of your committee needs to see in order to feel comfortable passing the bill.
I'll add into that. I thought I would like working on original legislation and coming up with ideas more, which I still really have a passion for. But it's actually, as I worked in the building, I learned that working on existing bills and legislation out there and trying to improve it can be its own reward too. One downside of coming up with your own bill ideas is then you have to find a coalition of people to support. And I've definitely had to scramble and had like a grad student colleague of mine testify in a bill on open access to state-funded research because sadly, there's not a huge active lobby group that's interested in that.
Do you want to share a little bit about the bill that
Sure.
you proposed and you got your
Yeah.
boss to carry?
Yeah, so during my fellowship year, I proposed a bill to make it a requirement that any money that the state spends on research grants, if those research grants result in a peer-reviewed publication, that the public would be able to access that within 12 months after the date of publication, similar to the federal guidelines, if any of you have worked with federal grants, NIH being the earliest adopter of that. So that was a really great way to combine my academic experience working on academic publishing and a bit on open access to this process here in California. And actually the original statute in California was also a Science Fellow bill in 2013, I believe, that started the small, narrow version California had until last year.
Awesome. Next question is, do you often see bills that are scientifically unsound that you can work to change and make more reasonable, like the patient example?
So I think the answer is sometimes, and when that's the case, often if you can correct it and show that there's strong evidence in opposition to it, sometimes it can be easy to fix that. But I think one thing that I've also realized in this work is that there are a lot of perspectives to consider when constructing legislation, and something can't be completely empirically baseless, but there are other factors to consider in addition to the scientific consensus when you're forming legislation. So I've sort of phrased it as one thing that I kind of learned to recognize throughout the course of this process, and I think in fact one of my biggest takeaways is that there are many different kinds of truth, and there's kind of the empirical truth that you seek in the academic world, and then there's the practical truth that you're seeking in the policymaking world. And those practical truths include how things can be implemented, what's actually functional. So of course, if something's just absolutely, completely empirically baseless, you're in a position where you should call that out and correct it. But the empirical backbone is only one of many factors that should be considered.
Anyone want to add to that? All right. Next question is, how many people typically apply to the fellowship each year? I'm happy to say we've been getting more and more and more applications every single year, which we think is a really great sign of a successful program. On average, it's about 100 to 150 applications each year. Next question, I'm interested in health and science. In the long run, can I choose which office or committee I work with? The short answer is no, you cannot, unfortunately. We certainly take it into consideration, and we would try to put you in that issue area if that is your top priority for your fellowship placement. However, we also know the offices very well, and it could be that all of the health possibilities are just a terrible fit for you in particular, for whatever reason. And so in that case, we would really strongly advise not to put you in that placement. But that's something that we would discuss with you, and I think that you would find that health impacts all different kinds of policies. You wouldn't need to just be in the health committee, for example. You know, the Newsom administration says health in all policies is one of the taglines they use, actually. So does anyone want to add to that at all?
I came in thinking along the same lines. So I came from a biomedical background, and so I really wanted to be in health. That said, I was in an environmental safety committee, which is still, you know, very sciencey, but there's a huge, the committee was actually born out of the health committee. And so there's a huge public health priority there, and everything we do is to protect public health. So that was really, really great for me because I was still able to touch health in that way. On the flip side of that, because I also did some personal office work, I had expressed that I was really interested in health, so I covered health and human services for my personal office. So I got to basically do vote recommendations on every single health bill that came through.
Thanks, Pajal. I believe we've answered all the questions online, so if I missed a question from you, please email it or re-type it in the group chat for us. Otherwise, the next question is, how do you feel your experience as fellows has opened doors for you after the fellowship?
I think I'm still, this is Sandra, I did the fellowship about a year ago now that I wrapped up. I'm still learning all the ways it's opened up doors, because sometimes coming out of it, like, what am I gonna do next? This is great, but who's gonna want me? But it turns out, yeah, both the Science Fellows network and reputation of the fellowship and the skills you get between having a PhD in a science or social science field and then having hands-on experience working in the California legislative process, that's a pretty amazing resume to bring to employers both here in California policy, but elsewhere too. So I think one of the biggest things for me is just having the confidence that I've got that first thing under my belt outside of grad school. I can work with people who aren't just academics in my narrow field, and I also can learn new things quickly, and that doesn't have to be super scary.
Yeah, I'm currently in the process of applying for jobs and interviewing for jobs right now. And what I've been finding is that I'm being considered for positions that I, a year ago, would have had absolutely no qualification to be part of. I have demonstrated, I think, through the course of the fellowship that despite the fact that my background is in neuroscience, I am capable of learning a new skill set quickly. I actually just had an interview yesterday where they asked me if I had any evidence of my ability to learn a new field just very quickly. And I, as a neuroscientist who was placed in the Assembly Judiciary Committee, had probably the best possible answer to that question. So I'm currently pursuing policy work, whether that be continuing in the public sector in a nonprofit, and I'm able to demonstrate some experience with the policy process in conjunction with sort of the analytical thinking skills that you develop through a PhD, and that appears to be quite valuable to a lot of jobs.
I think that one thing that CCST does a really good job with when I was a fellow is helping you have the confidence to explore these different things. Because a lot of us come in to the fellowship, and even throughout the fellowship kind of have this imposter syndrome of, you know, I've done this for a year, but even so, I'm still a scientist and I know how to pipette, and I've worked for a committee and I've done all this stuff, but it's very narrow. But they kind of, work on your confidence to get that out of you by doing professional development, a retreat that really makes you dive deep into what you want to get out of your career and kind of think about what the most important things are that you want to do next. And that alone helps you open up doors that you didn't even know were there or that you might have access to.
The next question is, have there been cases where people have switched offices or committees during the year, and why? I think we've only had, over the now 11 years, 10 years of the fellowship, I believe that's only happened one time. That was when we had a fellow that was jointly placed with an assembly member and the committee that she chaired, and then she lost the chairmanship of that committee. And so the fellow was given the choice to either move with the personal office or stay with the committee. The personal office already had 2 Science Fellow alumni on staff, so the current fellow chose to stay with the committee. So her position kind of shifted, but not really, and it was for a very specific reason. So we haven't really ever had that happen. That's not to say it won't, but it's highly unlikely. All right, one more question. My resume only shows research. How can I improve my resume for applying for the CCST fellowship? So I know we talked about what things can potential applicants do during grad school, but maybe you guys can reiterate a few specific examples or give some specific things that you could highlight on your resume.
I would say I haven't met a grad student yet who just did research. Everyone teaches that I've ever met. So teaching is a way that you're communicating science and your expertise to an audience that isn't quite as technically well-versed as you are. So I think there's obviously required teaching that happens. You can volunteer to do other teaching, science outreach. A lot of universities will have opportunities to get involved with K-12 schools or community science events, or even outside of science. People will do, I did an internship at a nonprofit, any kind of thing where you're looking to be beyond the narrow research world, which you probably already are. You just might have to think a little about how to frame that.
I totally agree with that. There's a lot of opportunities out there. I mean, you could volunteer for the state fair, state science fair. I did that for a couple of years. Various farmers markets will have science stands. I mean, there's just a lot of ways to get involved. Student government, grad student government, that should exist at your school. If there's a way to just start getting involved in that. But yeah, I mean, I think you probably are doing it. You just need to recognize it a little bit.
Yeah, like putting a different framework around peer review. Do you do peer review for your boss? That's a really important skill to have, because that's kind of what you do as a committee consultant when you're analyzing a bill. You're doing a review of the experiments that they're trying to do and how it's going to fail and how they could do it better. Do you do collaborations with other labs that show that you can work with differing perspectives and kind of work on a unified project in that way? So sort of reframing some of the things you already do that is much more than research, and then these other activities that Pashal mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that too. You know, a lot of people in research labs also train research assistants, research associates, do quite a bit of supervision or management with respect to them. That's a really valuable skill set as well, being able to manage people, because that's a lot of what you're doing around here in kind of a more diffuse way. And then also, I've just sort of found that having a diversity of experiences is a good thing here, whether or not they're the same experiences everyone else has, and kind of especially if they're not. And so things that you may not see as directly applicable, having not had the experience in this world, they might ultimately be very, very useful in building the relationships that you need to build in order to be successful.
Thank you. We'll do one more question in the 2 minutes we have left. Can you give an example of some of the professional development workshops that are held throughout the year?
One of the larger ones is a retreat on applying for jobs and working on your resume, your elevator pitch, and figuring out what's next. And really, CCST does a great job of giving you the space and structuring your thought process about what do I value, what did I like about this year, what do I want in my next workplace. I would say that's one that stands out for me.
Yeah, and CCST also brings in experts who do this for a living in terms of guiding scientists towards the actual professional work world. And so this past year we worked with someone from UCSF, and he was just phenomenal because he works primarily with either PhD students or postdocs. So he's well aware of our past experience, but also understands where we want to be. And so he's really good at helping us tailor our resumes in a way where, say, if we had a research background but wanted to go into communications, to really restructure that and think about it in a different way. Definitely things that you can't just find by Googling it. And so it was basically irreplaceable.
Also on Fridays, current fellows will have seminars where they're introduced to high-level executives in the executive branch and the legislature. And I don't know if I realized it during my year, but it's very important for professional development and networking in the future, and also just kind of seeing these amazing agency secretaries and what their career paths have been. And that was one of those seminars, in fact, was what inspired me to work at the Department of Finance after, because I realized that a lot of these people have a really good handle and background on budget in order to know how the state works. And so I think all of these experiences add up to just a really great opportunity in professional development.
Yeah, as a current fellow, I can say that I definitely do recognize the professional development value right now. I think what's really, really cool about those seminars is that you're having the opportunity to talk to some of the most successful people in the political world, some of the most influential people, heads of these agencies who have kind of storied careers of being in a variety of different types of positions. And you often find out that they've done pretty crazy different things and professional piano players and things like that. But those seminars are conducted in such a way where you have the opportunity to kind of openly ask questions about essentially whatever you want. So a lot of those are kind of in-depth policy questions, and you get to hear how they think. But we also frequently will ask them about how they got to where they are, what kinds of skills they think make them successful in it. And I've gotten a huge amount of value just out of hearing these really inspiring people talk about those sorts of things. And then I will also say, as someone who was sort of disillusioned coming out of my PhD about what I wanted to do with my life, I went to a lot of career development seminars, and not to discount the value of those career development seminars at UCSD, they were great. I think CCST provided some of the best professional development that I've had the opportunity to experience.
That is a very positive note to end on. Thank you, Landon. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope many of you will apply. Please feel free to email Jeffrey or myself with any follow-up questions you may have. Thank you. Have a good week.
Bye.